Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to DAG and to one of our talk platforms where we're constantly hoping to expand the world and horizon of art and the art world that we represent through conversations that we hope are multidisciplinary and extend our understanding not just of art, but the whole paradigm of the world around art. And what makes art take shape in a certain milieu at a certain time, in a certain period, in a certain environment, whether it be political or social, etc. And we've always been fortunate to get extremely interesting speakers to join us. And for this conversation, I don't think we could have found anyone better than Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee, who, of course, as a founding member of the Ashoka University, where he's been Chancellor and heads the Department of History, as an author of several books, a well-known historian, etc., will share with us today the ideas of Bengal being at the forefront of a Renaissance movement that was particular, of course, to the region and saw a flowering in many ways and representing many disciplines. And it was a Renaissance that impacted much of what happened and occurred in India as well. But what was interesting also was that while this was happening in Bengal, we didn't see a similar kind of flowering elsewhere in the country. And that is something that I think would be very interesting for us to, shed some light on and try and understand where Rudrangshu takes us with this. Rudrangshu is going to be talking on the Bengal Renaissance as we know it, what form the Renaissance took, whether there was in fact a Renaissance or should be qualified as a Renaissance. And then we will have a short conversation and open it up to all of you for any questions that you might have. So I'm not going to come in the way of you and your audience. Can we have a hand for Professor Rudrangshu Mukherjee, please? Thank you, and it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very nice of you to spare time this evening to come and listen to a Bong talking about his own inheritance. I'm going to kind of set two chronological bookends to what I'm going to talk about. The time span is important. 1815 to 1915. This is roughly the time span I'm going to talk about. This is not an arbitrary choice. There are very good reasons for choosing these two time limits, as it were. In 1815, a man called Ram Mohan Roy, who will feature very soon in what I have to say in a very significant way, comes and settles in Calcutta. 1915, man, and not a Bengali, completely uproots himself from South Africa, where he had been working as a very successful barrister at law and as well as fashioning a new form of public protest, uproots himself and comes and begins to work in India. The name doesn't need to be repeated. It's Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. 1915 is that date. And his arrival and his activities completely alter the intellectual, social, political landscape of India. So those are the reasons for, and it's also Gandhi's activities also shift the focus from Bengal to other areas and to an all India level. That's the major reason for these two major reasons for taking these two chronological landmarks. The other reason, of course, is that near about 1915, actually 1913, Rabindranath Tagore wins the Nobel Prize for Literature, the first Asian to do so, any Nobel Prize for that matter, not just literature. And you can consider that to be a kind of high water mark of what is considered to be by many historians the Bengal Renaissance. Now, there is no doubt that this 100 years that we are talking about saw a major efflorescence of culture, of ideas, of politics, and that's what made many historians, especially in the early 20th century, call this period period of Renaissance. We will have reasons to discuss whether this labeling, calling it a Renaissance, is at all valid or not. I'm going to spend a little time discussing some facets of what I just called an efflorescence before I discuss whether it can be called a Renaissance. Ramohn's arrival in 1815, Ramohn Roy was not an urban person in that sense of the word. He didn't belong to Calcutta. He belonged to the rural gentry, some 30 miles upriver from Calcutta. He made a fair bit of money those days from rents, from usury, from trade, and then came to settle in Calcutta in 1815, man of property, had 4 or 5 houses in Calcutta. And he started what I was nearly going to call it a revolution. It was not a revolution, but he started a kind of a reformation, if you like, by beginning the process of questioning what went by the name of tradition and orthodoxy among Hindus of Calcutta. And what he started with, the first facet of Hindu orthodoxy he began to question was idolatry. Did Hinduism consist of worshipping idols, and was that sanctioned by Hinduism? Or was that the most prominent feature of Hinduism as had been made out to be in quote unquote Indian tradition? Second thing he started, following from the first, was questioning the idea of polytheism, the worship of many different variants of divinity as idols. He wanted to move away from polytheism to monotheism, and he tried to do that by shifting the emphasis from a reading and an interpretation of the Vedas to a reading and the interpretation of the Upanishads, particularly the Isha Upanishad, the Katha Upanishad, and the Kena Upanishad. He did a Bengali translation and published the translation of the Kena Upanishad, the first Bengali translation of the Kena Upanishad. So Ramohn was trying to question some of the fundamentals of what went by the name of Hindu tradition, Hindu practices, Hindu rituals, and trying to introduce certain new types of piety and worship. For example, to take an example from the top of my head, Hindu orthodoxy, Hindu priestcraft had proclaimed that the verse in the Rig Veda known as the Gayatri could not actually be recited by non-Brahmins and certainly not by women. And Ramohn said, nothing of the sort, there is no prescription like this anywhere. The Gayatri can be uttered by anybody and everybody. He he freed that verse, if you like, from the Rig Veda. And that's one of the reasons why actually the Gayatri, what we call the Gayatri mantra or the Gayatri verse from the Rig Veda, has come to become so popular and so well known, not just among the Brahmins, but anybody who believes in that kinds of piety or worship. And now women also chant the Gayatri verse. This is one of Ram Mohan's singular contributions. Based on this questioning of orthodoxy, Ram Mohan also began to introduce or successfully introduced one particular legislation to prohibit a particular social custom, that is the practice of sati, the burning of a widow in the funeral pyre of her dead husband. And 1829, he persuaded the government through a petition, a signature campaign, that nowhere in the Hindu tradition, in the Hindu scriptures, had this been laid down that a woman should be treated thus and be actually, he said, murdered. He used that phrase, used that word, that this was an evil practice. It was a distortion that had been introduced by Brahmins with vested interests, and so it should be done away with, and the government should not actually be frightened of any kind of backlash by prohibiting sati, because there was enough scriptural evidence to show that no such practice had ever been promulgated or supported in the scriptures. This is, many people think that this is one of Ram Mohan's greatest contributions, and this is also the, one could say, the first really modern legislation that is introduced in Bengal first, but the 1829 legislation, even though it was promulgated in Calcutta, didn't apply just to Bengal, but wherever British rule existed in 1829, which was the very large part of India, except chunks of what is today Uttar Pradesh and parts of Punjab. This example of Ram Mohan Roy of questioning orthodoxy and also to promote the reform of Orthodox Hindu society was not something that remained confined to only his lifetime. It was taken up by a person who was not exactly like Ram Mohan Roy in many ways, but he was also an outsider to Calcutta society. He was born in a very remote village in Western Bengal, what is today Midnapur, the district of Midnapur, and he came to Calcutta at the age of 8 to study. He was a prodigiously gifted young boy, and he made himself remarkably erudite, so erudite that he was given the title of Vidyasagar, that is to say, the ocean of learning. Many people don't know today that in those days, when Sanskrit learning had not completely disappeared, there was no BA degree or MA degree in Sanskrit. Sanskrit institutions that taught Sanskrit learning gave their own kind of titles. Like if you were an expert on Sanskrit logic, you would be called Nyarotno, the jewel of Nyay, jewel of law, and so on. We could be a jewel of poetry and so on. But somebody who mastered all the various streams of Sanskrit learning was given the title of Vidyasagar. So where all the streams merged and fused, as it were, ocean of learning. Vidyasagar earned for himself a completely rural boy with a semi-literate father and an illiterate mother. He came to Bengal, made himself hugely successful as a scholar, and earned for himself this title. Now, Vidyasagar also, like Ram Mohan, was very concerned about the status of women in Hindu society, particularly the status of widows. Again, like Ram Mohan had been concerned about the killing of widows. What concerned Vidyasagar was what happened to widows who were no longer being burnt or had not been burnt even in the past. And Vidyasagar discovered that they were treated extremely badly in the families where they lived, sometimes as maids to run chores, sometimes they were the victims of the lust of male relatives, and when they became pregnant because of that act of sex, they were thrown out of the house, they took to prostitution or tried abortions which seriously injured them, sometimes killed them. And noticing this kind of phenomena around him, Vidyasagar moved again, like Ram Mohan, a petition to the government in 1855 to legalize widow remarriage. So this is a kind of a second piece of modern legislation, if you like. 1855, the Remarriage Hindu Widows Remarriage Act. So this is at the level of societal change, this is a kind of reformation that is taking place. Ram Mohan, Vidyasagar being two very remarkable examples of this. But there were other changes that were taking place, again at the level of society. The most significant of those was at the level of education. The introduction of Western style education. Ram Mohan again is one of the pioneers in this. He was one of the people that proposed the idea that a college be set up in Calcutta to impart Western style education. And it's very interesting, there's an anecdote here which ties up the point about idolatry and education. In 1815, I'm again going back to 1815, Ram Mohan organized a series of what today I suppose we'll call discussion groups or study circles in his house, where like-minded people met to discuss some common issue. And in one such meeting in his house, he had called of friends. The issue was actually idolatry, how idolatry could be eradicated, the evils of idolatry and how idolatry could be eradicated. Now, in this gathering appeared a Scotsman, uninvited. He was a gate crasher, but he could crash the gates of Ram Mohan's house because Ram Mohan was a very close friend of his. His name was David Hare. And having heard the discussion of 15, 16 people in the room, David Hare said, look, I think you guys are approaching this problem completely from the wrong end. I suggest that you set up or take the initiative to set up an educational institution. And once education spreads, idolatry will automatically disappear. You cannot remove idolatry by just a government fiat. You have to change the mental horizons, mental landscapes of people. And the only way you can do that is through education. So why don't you begin to think along these lines? And thus was implanted the idea of an educational institution. which was formed or established and started functioning in 1817. It was called the Hindu College, which in 1855 became Presidency College, in 2000 became Presidency University, and you think of any well-known Bengali, you'll probably discover that he went to Presidency College. I mean, you know, except for Rabindranath Tagore, who did not go to any university, all famous Bengalis went to Presidency University. I mean, Satyajit Ray, Amartya Sen, Rudrangshu Mukherjee, you name them, and, they went to Presidency College. So thus, it started off as Hindu College. The name is significant, I'll come back to that, and its purposes are also significant because it declared that it would be a Western style educational institution, and its syllabi and pedagogy would be those that were being followed by institutions in England, particularly Oxford, Cambridge, and London. So those were the kinds of subjects that were being taught. I mean, you know, literature, political economy, natural sciences, Western mathematics as different from Indian mathematics, and astronomy as distinct from astrology, and so on and so forth. And this, of course, this I would call a paradigm shift, not just a reformation. It brings about major currents of change in Bengali society as well as elsewhere in India, because the Hindu College has many, I wouldn't say imitators, but many followers. In Bombay, for example, Elphinstone College, 1835, 17 years after, 17, 18 years after Hindu College. Same kind of aspiration, same kind of role model, if you like, that there has to be a generation of young men, and I'm using the word men deliberately because both these institutions were male dominated and male oriented. Women were not allowed to enter the portals of these institutions, who should be rationally driven, who should be well read, who should be educated, and therefore also be capable of gaining employment in the growing British Indian administration. This, of course, leads the mushrooming of such colleges, leads in 1857 the British government forming 3 universities in 1857 January: University of Calcutta, University of Bombay, and University of Madras. You might wonder, why not University of Delhi? The simple reason that the Bengal presidency, there were 3 presidencies in India at that point of time: the Calcutta presidency, the Bengal presidency, the Bombay presidency, and the Madras presidency. The Bengal presidency actually extended right up to Delhi and beyond. So they didn't think it was necessary to have either a presidency college in Delhi or a separate university in Delhi. It fell under Calcutta. So that's the reason for Delhi University coming rather late than these 3 pioneering universities. Again, these 3 pioneering universities had the same, they took over the aspirations and the kind of pedagogy and syllabi that Hindu College had started with, Elphinstone College had taken over, and then the university, of course, in a more expansive way, followed that same model, as it were. Now, so social reforms, educational changes that are taking place, and a third facet of this changes, transformations that are occurring in Bengal is through this education, the introduction of rational thinking and rational modes of argument. I know Amartya Sen has made it very famous, the argumentative Indian, but the argumentative Indian, if it originated anywhere, it actually originates within the Bengal Renaissance, because certain individuals took initiatives to establish and to demonstrate how arguments should be made. Emphasis on should. You could not just assert and say that this is an argument. For example, again I go back to Ram Mohan Roy. When Ram Mohan Roy began writing about the evils of sati, as you would expect, he was viciously attacked really viciously attacked. I mean, today's trolls are nothing compared to what Ram Mohan Roy was made a victim of. And Ram Mohan had to defend himself. He had to reply to these criticisms that were being made. And one of the conditions he made in this criticism and the defense was that when you are saying that such and such text says this, please cite. Give us the evidence where I can find this particular verse, find this particular sloka. So I can verify, and readers can verify, whether what you are saying is in fact a correct representation of what the text says. So if you are saying Ram Mohan wrote this, please say where Ram Mohan wrote this, in what essay Ram Mohan wrote this, chapter, text, chapter, verse, page number, whatever is relevant. So he was establishing that arguments should be based on verifiable evidence and state the evidence. So that's one very important mode of argumentation, if you like, that Ram Mohan established through his own writings, and he made others follow these modes of argumentation. He set up a template, as we would say these days. Vidyasagar went on to do the same thing, and others who were writing on social issues, and the number was growing as we move into the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, and right down to the end of the century, began to follow the same practice, that arguments should be based on verifiable evidence and not on a series of assertions. Second, arguments need language. Language that can be lucidly written and therefore comprehensible. When Ram Mohan first started writing in Bengali, it was a very heavily Sanskritized Bengali, which wasn't actually understood by even very intelligent people, because they did not have that Sanskrit lexicon at their command. This Ram Mohan began to break, and others after Ram Mohan, particularly in the 1830s, 1840s, and with the arrival of Tagore's writings in 1870s, 1880s, the Bengali language became much more lucid and much more comprehensible and much more in tune with how people spoke. So the gap between spoken language and the written language began to narrow. And in fact, in certain cases, it just disappeared. People wrote the way people speak. This was one major development that was taking place, and it was making possible modes of argumentation and the more widespread use of rational arguments that are comprehensible to everybody who can read or write. Now, to the third layer, as it were, of the same process, to transform a language, you have to give it a structure. And language, as we know, I mean, this doesn't bear repeating to this audience, language is based on alphabets and letters, formation of words. And to bring language, written language, closer to oral speech, you also need punctuation. People pause when they speak. Bengali had no punctuation marks. It had, in fact, if you look at Ram Mohan's Bengali, you will find he is using only 2 punctuation marks. One is a straight horizontal line, which is a short pause, vertical line, a straight vertical line, which is a short pause, and 2 vertical lines, which is a longer pause, indicating that a thought process has ended here. No commas, no semicolons, and most importantly, no queries. So you wouldn't know what is being stated as a question and what is being put down as a statement. Now, Vidyasagar is the person who begins, through his understanding of the English language, even though he was a Sanskrit Pandit, he taught himself English, learnt English, and he began this process of introducing punctuation marks into Bengali prose. And of course, people who came after him, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, Rabindranath Tagore, and so on and so forth, carried on this work. And, you know, even Vidyasagar didn't include the exclamation mark, but later writers introduced exclamation mark. Vidyasagar didn't introduce a colon, later writers did so on. So the development of the modern Bengali language, the process, and it's an ongoing process, it's still evolving, I hope it never stops evolving, was begun in the 19th century. Similarly with the alphabet, the arrangement of the alphabet according to how words are or letters are formed by the tongue impacting either the top of the mouth or the teeth or the lips. Vidyasagar arranged the Bengali alphabet borrowed from the Devanagari script. He gave those alphabets shape and a structure. So the transformation of the Bengali language, making it a vehicle for modern argumentation, is very much a product of this period of efflorescence that I am talking about, these 100 years. But language, again, doesn't bear repeating, has its own momentum. Language was not just something instrumental in making rational arguments. Language is also a vehicle of creativity. So using this evolving language and learning from Western models or modes of creativity, Bengali creative writers started writing in or creating genres which were previously unknown in Bengal. The sonnet, for example, lyric poetry, complex rhyme structures, including blank verse. The novel, for example, first written in 1865 in Bengali. No novels were known before that. Again, borrowing from the West. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, who wrote the first Bengali novel, clearly said, I learned to write novels from Walter Scott. Third, drama. So, Kalidas might have written plays, but were not in Bengali. So, in Bengali, playwriting starts again in the 1860s, clearly modeled on European drama, particularly, of course, Shakespeare, which they had read. These students who were writing had become writers now. They had read in Hindu College and Presidency College. The teachers had taught them Shakespeare. And because theatre, drama developed, theatre developed. That is to say, on-stage performances. Now, theatre was part of rural folk culture in Bengal, but this was theatre in the round, what is today called theatre in the round. People sat all around and, mythological stories, etc., bits of the Mahabharata, the Ramayana were acted out through the night. But this was different. This was the proscenium stage. On a stage, high up, actors playing out their bit roles, and audience like this sitting in front. The proscenium stage theatre emerges in Bengal also in this period as well. And this is a point I will come to in a minute. This form of theatre has a very important impact on the development of another kind of consciousness. Now, before I come to another kind of this other kind of consciousness, these students who have now become writers, intellectuals, trained in rational modes of thinking, trained in modern modes of argumentation, when they emerge from the portals of their educational institutions, be it the University of Calcutta, Presidency College, Hindu College, they find that there is a very major divorce between what they have been taught by their teachers in the classrooms and the reality that they face. What are some of the things that they have been taught? Because this is a borrowed pedagogy from Britain, Oxford, Cambridge, London, some of the things that they have been taught: the virtues of liberty, the virtues of democracy, the virtues of the market, political economy, right? When they come out, they find that there is no liberty, there is no democracy. India is actually ruled by a form of despotism. And there are no equal opportunities for Indians. The other thing that they had been taught in these institutions is that India had no history. India had stories. India had myths. India had fictitious kings. History in India began with the arrival of British rule in India. Thomas Babington Macaulay, James Mill wrote this in so many terms. James Mill famously said that the whole of Indian history is just a part of British history. It's a chapter of British history. Macaulay said, imagine the contempt. Macaulay said that all of Indian learning will not fit even in half a bookshelf in my library. So, contempt for India, Indian culture at least. And here are these boys, young men, alert, learning to read, loving to read. They come out and find everything that they had learned is actually baseless in reality. So what do? They say, they carry on the process of questioning. And one of the things they do is the Indian past something to be held in contempt? what we were taught in our classrooms via Macaulay and James Mill, is that the valid depiction of the Indian past? Let's look into it. We now know how to read, how to think for ourselves. Let us look into the Indian past. And then they start delving into the Indian past to discover that no, exactly the opposite is true. India had a very rich cultural, literary, political tradition. This was not something that Indians should be ashamed of. Quite the opposite, this is something that Indians should be proud of. The birth of pride in one's past is at the root of all forms of nationalism. And this is the generation of the first proto-nationalists, if you like. To this proto-nationalism is added, and this is the new kind of consciousness I'm talking about, that British rule doesn't practice what it preaches. British rule in India is actually carrying out a very large-scale exercise in self-interest by exploiting India and Indians to enrich Britain. Okay? And people begin to write about this. First, in the Indian languages, in journals, literary magazines, and then in English. Product of Elphinstone College, Dadabhai Naoroji, the first person to write about poverty and un-British rule in India. R.C. Dutt, product of Presidency College, who writes a 2-volume account of the economic history of India under British rule, drawing attention to the drain of wealth and the exploitation of India. But this is where I want to tie up with theatre. In the late 1850s and early 1860s, peasants, common peasants, in parts of the districts, some districts of Bengal, who were forced to cultivate indigo, rose in rebellion because of the oppression practiced by white indigo planters. This came to be reported, this what was called, quote unquote, disturbances. Actually, they were peasant rebellions that were taking place in the districts. In these magazines and journals, I'm talking about one prominent journal with the name called the Hindu Patriot. Editor, another product of Presidency College, Harish Chandra Mukherjee. Graphic descriptions of these peasant insurgencies. And on the basis of that, those graphic discrepancies, in 1860s, 1864 if I'm not mistaken, a young playwright writes a play in Bengali called Nil Darpan. Translated means the mirror of indigo, where he actually presents in theatrical and dramatized form the exploitation of the indigo planters, white indigo planters, and the oppression suffered by the indigo growing peasants and their acts of rebellion. And this heightens the consciousness. Theatre heightens the consciousness of the viewers that the British are not doing any good to our common people. And this, added to the sense of pride, develops the emergence or makes possible the emergence of nationalism. So it is no surprise at all that some of the early members and early leaders of the Indian National Congress are actually Bengalis. The first president was W.C. Banerjee, R.C. Dutt became a president, Surendranath Banerjee became a president, but there were people from other parts of India as well. I mentioned Dadabhai Naoroji, Badruddin Tayyabji from Aligarh, all products of this same growing new kind of consciousness that is partly a product of Western education, rational modes of thinking, rational modes of consciousness and argumentation, but also a refashioning of their own consciousness through the modes of questioning that they have learned from Western learning. So, Western learning, in Shakespeare's play Tempest, Caliban utters the famous line, "You taught me language and I learnt how to curse." So these people were educated by the British and now they were turning the same instruments against the British. And thus is born Indian nationalism in this period of 100 years, the last 25 years of those 100 years that I demarcated sees the emergence of nationalism in India, across India, not just in Bengal. Now, so can we then, to come back to the question with which we began, and I've already taken too much of your time, can we then call this efflorescence a renaissance? The answer is a very qualified no. The reasons being the following. The term Renaissance, again, as all of you know, has a very specific Western connotation. What happened in a part of Western Europe, starting in Italy and then spreading across Northern Europe, a forms of learning, which looked and reinterpreted the past, but through that reinterpretation produced the spirit of individualism, and that individualism resulted in the creation of a separation between the private and the public, the emergence of civil society which was different from the state, and the civil society became the sphere or the realm of human activity and social transformation. This is a kind of a whistle-stop summary of what the Western Renaissance was like. Now let us look at what happened, and now I am coming to the darker side of this efflorescence. I've spoken of the light, now it's time to look at the darker side of the Renaissance, of the Bengal Renaissance. First, Rammohn Roy, great propagator, great promoter of rational learning, described British rule in 1823 as a gift of divine providence. What is the mode of argumentation? It's a sheer assertion. No evidence cited there. Okay? And this is a theme that continues right through the century till the very late last 20 years or last 25 years, as I said. Loyalism. The British are here to do good. Look at what even Nauroji is saying. It is un-British rule. In other words, if it becomes British rule, then it's acceptable. He's not questioning the fact that no country should rule another country. If it rules it properly, like Britain rules herself, if Britain rules India in the same manner, I'm fine with it. Okay? So, that loyalism. And that loyalism leads to people like Rammohn and even Vidyasagar with all his rationality to remain silent, if not oblivious, of the fact that under the impact of British, quote unquote, British free trade, Indian manufactures, handicrafts industry are completely being destroyed and in certain cases eradicated altogether. The process that historians call deindustrializations. Third, the wealth, some of these people like Ramon came from very wealthy backgrounds, like Tagore's, for example. Tagore's grandfather, Dwarakanath Tagore, was supposed to be one of the richest men in the world in the 1830s, 1840s. A large part of his income actually was rentier income. He had large landed estates in Orissa, present-day Bangladesh, parts of present-day West Bengal. The Tagores lived on rentier income. So this was not a productive income. This is where whatever happened in Bengal, call it Bengal Renaissance or don't, is very distinct from what is happening in Europe. The Renaissance and its aftermath in Western Europe coincides with the development of capitalism, wealth making of a completely different kind than was seen in pre-capitalist eras. The Industrial Revolution is also an integral part of the historical process or the historical aftermath of the Bengal Renaissance. Nothing like that happens in Bengal or in India. So these are some of the dark sides of the Bengal Renaissance that makes us question whether the label is valid or not. And this is the last point I will make, there was no civil society. Why do I say that? Is it a mere assertion? No. Look at the life of Vidyasagar. He tried to reform one aspect, at least a very important aspect of Hindu society, status of women, tried to introduce one of the pioneers in India, like Jyotirao Phule in Western India, one of the pioneers to introduce female education in Bengal. Unsuccessful, because there was no societal backing for the kind of reforms and the kind of education he was trying to introduce. In fact, when he introduced the widow remarriage bill, Vidyasagar had to walk the streets of Calcutta with two bouncers on his right and left because his life had been threatened by Orthodox Hindus in Calcutta. He left Calcutta as a completely disillusioned man, and he went back where? He went back to a tribal village where Santals lived. He embraced their simple, innocent lives, which was free from the falsity and the hypocrisy that he had witnessed in Calcutta, which educated or not educated had not supported his reform movements, his attempt to reform Bengali society, Hindu society. I deliberately said uneducated because I wanted to qualify it. He walked with bouncers on the streets of Calcutta. But the weavers of Bengal, particularly in the major weaving center of Shantipur, those of you who worked with handicrafts know that Shantipur is still the major weaving center. And some of the best Bengali saris and dhotis come out of Shantipur. Shantipur weavers is a special tribute to Vidyasagar and his attempts to change the status of women and widows in Bengali society, produced a special dhoti. Dhotis have borders, as you know, and instead of the black border, they created a dhoti which said, and on the border, in Bengali, of course, I'll translate it in English, it says, "May Vidyasagar become immortal. Vidyasagar chirojibi hok." The common people who the figures of the Bengal Renaissance largely neglected and were indifferent to recognized what Vidyasagar was doing. But those who were educated did not. And that's one of the major dark sides of the Bengal Renaissance. So I'm very hesitant to call it a Bengal Renaissance or a Renaissance of any kind. Thank you.
Thanks, Rudrangshu. In fact, what I did want to begin with, I will take a couple of minutes a little later to talk about what happened in the world of art, but purely to establish this whole idea of the Renaissance and the fact that it is contentious, and you establish that through the rational thinking and pedagogy that emerged out of Calcutta. Thank you for that. The way we understand the Renaissance as a very general term is a space for ideas, but also creativity. It's also because we see a flowering of these ideas through largely the creative arts, and we understand it through art and architecture and literature and so on and so forth. Or at least that's the idea that we inherited. And here we see that despite the ideas and perhaps that element of individuality towards which one is hoping to reach out to, there is the idea of protest. And it is the protest in Bengal. I think the reforms come first, protest follows, that we are seeing as the Renaissance. So are we saying that despite everything that happens in Bengal, literature, the printing presses and literature does open up, theatre does open up, and yes, we have Neil Darpan, but we also have aspects of theatre playing out in very many other ways, etc. Women do come out into public spaces, which, whether we qualify that as a reform or take it into our understanding of Renaissance, or say that whether there is a Renaissance or not. Where does the idea of the liberal arts and the florescence of creative arts come into play in this whole paradigm?
So, art is
and for me, art is art, architecture,
yeah,
literature,
so
all of that, theatre.
Art is playing a role here, not so much as a kind of a direct protest, but largely as satire. If you look at the paintings, the prints in the next room of the Babu and the Bibi, you will see some of the satire there. A woman beating her Babu or threatening her Babu with a broom. There are two such prints there, okay? And there are innumerable prints available on the same theme as well. Similarly, in prose, but particularly in drama, there is emerging this theme of self-criticism. Are we going the right way by borrowing everything from the West? Is our mimesis of the West really a fruitful endeavor? And are we thus, in fact, mocking ourselves by taking this path? I mean, there is one of the finest plays written in the Bengali language. It's called, again, written by the same person who wrote The Mirror of Indigo, the same dramatist, Dinobandhu Mitra. The play is in Bengali called Shodobar Ekadashi. The translation is a little difficult. The most literal translation would be the widowhood of a married woman, okay, where the main character, protagonist, is immensely learned, I mean, he has the Upanishads, he has Shakespeare, Milton, Wordsworth, Keats at his fingertips. But he does no work, and he is a complete drunk. Complete drunk. As long as he's awake, he's drinking. And so hence the name of the play, that a woman who is married to such a man is actually a widow. Okay?
Yeah, yeah.
So this satire is playing itself out. I mean, are these characters, highly educated, out of Presidency College or Hindu College, by imitating the West, are they doing justice to themselves? Are they emerging as individuals? Or are they becoming, a distorted image of themselves? So this self-criticism is very important, and this self-criticism and satire is also available in some of the 19th century pots that you see, particularly coming out of Kalighat. Okay? And very importantly, these Kalighat paintings, the Kalighat pots, are not in many ways an imitation of Western forms of painting. They are developments and evolutions of indigenous forms of paintings that already existed in the rural/folk world and folk culture. You see, so I think that is very important. And you know this much better than I do, that when the Bengal school emerges with Abanindranath and Gaganendranath, they are in many ways not harking to the West. They are looking at Japanese painting, they are looking at Chinese painting, they are looking at Mughal miniatures. And the only major Gaganendranath painting that is inspired by Western painting I can think of is a wonderful painting called Rabindranath Tagore in the Land of the Birds. It's a Cubist influence there. I mean, direct influence of Braque and Picasso. But other than that, I mean, the Shantiniketan school or the Bengal school is very much an Oriental and Indian style of painting. And Tagore, who is Rabindranath Tagore, who is completely untrained as a painter, never learnt in any way to paint, and took up painting rather late in his life. He was born in 1861 and he starts painting in 1926, 1927. I mean, really the twilight years of his life. And you can see that these are not in any way paintings that are influenced by Western ideas, Western styles of paint. These are just sui generis in a sense, So in the world of painting, I would say, the influence of the West is minimal, and it's only visible in those painters who are coming out of the Government College of Art and being trained by people like Percy Brown and so on.
Which happened with Abanindranath Tagore and all as well. Yeah. But one more thing that it still interests me, this whole idea of why Calcutta becomes this center crucible for so many ideas emerging, etc. Is it because Calcutta, as the first city of empire, is the place that first becomes urbanized in India, where princely kingdoms do not have, I mean, you talk about an absence of civil society, but the princely kingdoms don't have civil society in the way we expect it. There is a dominant figure, there is the palace controls everything. You work with the palace or not at all. And therefore, there is a sense of family-led traditions and hierarchies, etc. that is set. The city breaks that. The city allows for change.
City creates public spaces.
Absolutely, yes. So are these changes resonating because it is the first urban environment that we are seeing in the country?
Yes, very definitely. It's the first urban environment that we are seeing in this country. And also, the first urban environment that is feeling and reeling under the impact of Western ideas and Western presence.
So it's learning from the West, and it's turning the very learning into something else.
Yeah.
And certainly that happens. I mean, we see how very popularly the Battala presses
Yes.
and the kind of images that emerge out of there, the very local tradition of printmaking that emerges out of there.
Calcutta is the British bridgehead.
It is. And you mentioned, for example, the Bengal school, etc. However, it's not self-schooling over there. There is the Western tradition of art practice. There is the element of entering the whole idea of national identity and seeking that, and therefore this alignment with Japan and China. And kind of turning back to one's learning. But you retain the drafting skill of the Western style. You mentioned Cubism, which is a very strong part of Gaganendranath Tagore's work, etc. You combine all of that into an Orientalism and you create a new language. And for me, yes, that kind, even though it's been kind of called revivalism and romanticism, etc., over the years by critics, but that is certainly a new efflorescence, a new idea taking birth, which ties in with the idea of what we qualify as Renaissance, surely.
Renaissance literally means a rebirth of the past. I don't see any rebirth of the past here. There is certainly a refashioning that is happening under the impact of the West. And, you know, if you take Jamini Roy, for example, a painter I particularly like, is those skills of drafting, of line, of framing that are so important in Western figurative painting. Jamini Roy takes all that, masters all that, but he fuses that with the folk art that he saw in his own Bankura district and stylizes that to break from the Bengal school, from the Abanindranath Nanandalal Bose of painting, and bring into being, I don't know what you call that genre, it's just Roy sui generis.
It is a form of folk modernism, etc., that advances a certain language or a certain
and he's influenced by the pot paintings as well.
Oh, absolutely. That's the root for where that lies. You also talked about Rabindranath Tagore being unschooled and painting pretty much sui generis. But Rabindranath Tagore is traveling very extensively around the world.
Of course.
He's visiting museums. He's seeing exhibitions very extensively. So there is definitely the idea of what is happening in the West filtering down into us. So it may be individual.
This morning I was telling Ritu, I mean, a little known painting because he didn't sign it. Man who never traveled to the West. I mean, St. Paul's Cathedral has a Jamini Roy painting of the Last Supper. Where did he get to know about the Last Supper? And he did it in his own way, you know. These are not Western figures at all. These are his own stylized representations of the 12 disciples and Christ. Sitting across a table.
Surely you would get to know it in the city because there were the churches, there were the Catholics.
He probably went and saw Zoffany's Last Supper.
Absolutely, yes, which is there.
Which is there.
So absolutely. So there was the exposure, there was all of this, there was a reclaiming of a lot. And I agree with you that therefore in the reclaiming and refashioning and particularly turning it into a protest, you're not really seeing a renaissance. You're seeing a birthing of ideas, and that birthing of ideas changes and foments many things. And that is where Calcutta and Bengal lead.
And that's why I also find using the term Renaissance is a little restrictive.
Or a little overgenerous.
Why pigeonhole it?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely, for sure.